Not every band got to go out on their own terms. Some recorded a song that the public simply refused to accept, and the fallout was enough to fracture something that had taken years to build. Here are 12 songs from the 1960s that bombed so hard they destroyed bands. Number 12, Their Satanic Majesty's Request by the Rolling Stones. This one requires a small clarification up front. Their Satanic Majesty's Request was the 1967 album, not a single, and it did not destroy the Rolling Stones. But it came close to derailing them permanently, and the story of what it did to their internal dynamic and public standing is worth understanding. Released in December of 1967, it was widely read as the Stones' attempt to follow Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which had come out 6 months earlier. Critics were not kind. Many called it a pale imitation, a band chasing a trend they hadn't originated and didn't fully understand. The psychedelic experimentation on the record felt forced compared to what the band had done naturally with Between the Buttons earlier that year. The elaborate cover art, the exotic instrumentation, the fragmentary song structures, all of it read as the Stones trying on clothes that didn't fit them. It was their worst reviewed album to that point, and it sold below expectations in the United States. Radio had difficulty placing it. Fans who had followed them for the tough, blues-rooted singles of the early 1960s were confused. The rock press, which had praised the band consistently since 1964, used the record as an occasion to question whether they had lost what had made them interesting. What it nearly destroyed was the creative partnership between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. Both men have described that period as a genuine low point in their working relationship. They felt they had lost direction and allowed outside influences and fashionable pressures to pull them away from what had made the band matter. Andrew Loog Oldham, their manager and producer since 1963, departed during the making of the album over creative disagreements and never returned. His exit removed one of the stabilizing forces that had shaped the band's commercial identity. The Stones recovered by stripping everything back and returning to their roots. Jumpin' Jack Flash, released in May 1968, was a deliberate course correction. Hard, direct, and unambiguous. It worked. But the Satanic Majesty's period demonstrated how quickly a wrong creative move could cost a band its identity and its critical standing, and how much damage that could do to the people inside it. Number 11, Journey to the Center of the Mind by the Amboy Dukes. The Amboy Dukes were a Detroit rock band formed in 1964, and by the late 1960s, they featured a young Ted Nugent on lead guitar, a player whose instincts were already pointing toward the aggressive, hard-edged rock he would become famous for in the 1970s. Journey to the Center of the Mind was their biggest hit, reaching number 16 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1968. It was a psychedelic track with an obvious reference to drug use embedded in its title and concept. And Nugent was one of the genuinely rare musicians of that era who refused to use drugs, had never used them, and had no intention of starting. The song's commercial success created a serious problem for the band's long-term identity. It positioned the Amboy Dukes as a psychedelic drug rock act in the public imagination, which was a categorization that Nugent found both inaccurate and professionally limiting. He was on record early and consistently about his abstinence from drugs and alcohol, which made being the frontman of a band associated primarily with a psychedelic drug anthem an uncomfortable position to occupy. As the decade turned, the band began losing members who wanted to continue exploring psychedelic territory, while Nugent pushed in the opposite direction toward heavier, more aggressive rock. The lineup changed repeatedly through 1969, 1970, and into the early 1970s, with almost no consistency beyond Nugent himself. Different versions of the Amboy Dukes released albums in 1969, 1970, and 1974, but none of them captured anything close to the commercial or cultural attention of the 1968 single. By 1975, Nugent had quietly dissolved the Amboy Dukes name entirely and relaunched as a solo artist. His self-titled debut that year was the beginning of a far more successful chapter, but the band that had briefly given him a hit had been consumed by the contradiction between the song that made them and the artist who performed it. Number 10, My Generation, live at Leeds version by The Who. The Who's original recording of My Generation was a landmark, a 1965 single that became one of the defining youth anthems of the decade, with Roger Daltrey's deliberately stuttering vocal and Pete Townshend's feedback-drenched guitar creating something that felt genuinely confrontational in a way that most pop music carefully avoided. The song connected because it said what a generation of young people actually felt about authority and complacency. It was also the beginning of a problem that nearly ended the band before they had fully begun. The instrument destruction had started at a club gig in 1964 when Townsend accidentally broke his guitar on a low ceiling and kept playing, and the audience responded with enthusiasm. Moon began demolishing his drum kit. The destruction became part of the act, and then it became the expectation. Audiences came specifically to see the demolition at the climax of the show, and the band felt the pressure to deliver it every night. The costs were staggering and ongoing. Guitars, amplifiers, drum kits. The band was spending far more on equipment than they were earning from the performances themselves for a significant stretch of their early career. Their management and record label were persistently frustrated. The band's finances were in serious disorder, and the debt accumulated in ways that created genuine uncertainty about whether they could continue. Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp, their managers, worked constantly to find performance fees and record advances that could keep the operation solvent. The situation did not destroy the band, but it came close enough to financially collapse them that by the late 1960s, producing something commercially sustainable had become a real necessity. Tommy in 1969 was the response, a calculated shift toward album rock that could support them beyond the spectacle of the live show. My Generation nearly became their epitaph before they had made their best work. Number 9, You Keep Me Hangin' On by Vanilla Fudge. Vanilla Fudge had a substantial hit in 1968 with their heavy, slow-burning cover of the Supremes' You Keep Me Hangin' On, which reached number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. The band's approach, taking familiar pop songs and stretching them into extended, heavily arranged psychedelic workouts, was genuinely innovative for its moment. They slowed things down, added organ textures, built tension and release in ways that the original Motown production had not, and earned serious attention as a result. Atlantic Records saw real commercial potential. The problem was that their own approach was almost impossible to follow with original material. Their subsequent singles failed to connect with anywhere near the same impact. The label pushed them toward more accessible commercial territory, which the band resisted, then attempted, then resisted again. Their albums sold respectably but produced nothing that approached the success of that first breakthrough cover. The internal disagreements about direction grew louder with each passing year. By 1970, those disagreements had become irresolvable. Bassist Tim Bogert and drummer Carmine Appice had already effectively redirected their energies toward what would become Cactus, a harder rock band, and later the trio Beck, Bogert, and Appice, with British guitarist Jeff Beck. Keyboardist Mark Stein and guitarist Vince Martell were left without a workable lineup. Vanilla Fudge officially dissolved in 1970, having been together for barely 3 years. They had found a genuinely distinctive sound with that first cover recording, and then spent the rest of their existence unable to agree on where it should go from there. Number 8, East West, by the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band were one of the most respected outfits in the American blues rock world of the mid-1960s. Their 1965 debut album had introduced a large audience to an electrified, Chicago-influenced sound that was raw and serious in a way that much of the pop landscape was not. Their 1966 album East West and its 13-minute title track that drew on Eastern musical scales and extended jazz-influenced improvisation, pushed into territory that was genuinely ahead of its time and that influenced nearly every jammin' that followed. Critics admired it substantially. The commercial audience stayed away in equally substantial numbers. The label, Elektra, had hoped the band could cross over into the mainstream market that was responding to the British invasion. East West made clear that the Butterfield band was not interested in that kind of compromise. The record sold modestly. The pressure from the label to simplify and commercialize created persistent friction between what the band wanted to make and what the business needed them to deliver. Guitarist Mike Bloomfield, the most celebrated member beyond Butterfield himself, and a musician whose reputation extended well beyond the band, left in 1967 to form the Electric Flag with guitarist Barry Goldberg and drummer Buddy Miles. His departure was a serious blow to the band's identity. Bloomfield's guitar work had been as central to the East-West sound as Butterfield's harmonica. The band continued recording with replacement guitarists, including Elvin Bishop and later David Sanborn on saxophone in an expanded lineup, but the commercial traction never came. By the early 1970s, the Butterfield band had dissolved, a victim of the gap between what they were best at and what the market was prepared to reward. Number 7. In Agata da Vida, single edit by Iron Butterfly. Iron Butterfly's In Agata da Vida is one of the stranger commercial stories in late 1960s rock. The full album version ran to 17 minutes and took up the entire second side of the LP, an unusual decision for 1968 that turned out to be the right one. The album became one of the best-selling releases of 1968 and remained on Atlantic Records' catalog for years as a consistently strong seller. The band had stumbled onto something real. The 2-minute single edit, stripped of the extended organ solo, the drum solo, and essentially everything that had made the original interesting to the people who bought the album, went largely unnoticed on radio. Atlantic had hoped to cross the band into the top 40 singles market that was still the primary commercial engine of the era. What the radio edit demonstrated was that the song's appeal was inseparable from its length. It worked precisely because it did not behave like a single. The band found themselves in an unusual and ultimately unmanageable position. Enormously successful in album sales, essentially invisible as a singles act, and under persistent pressure from the label to produce music that could function in both worlds. Their music was almost physically unsuited to the 3-minute radio format that Atlantic needed them to deliver. Doug Ingle, the organist and primary songwriter, and the rest of the band disagreed persistently about how to respond to that commercial pressure. Members departed and were replaced. The creative chemistry that had produced the original album dissolved in the process of trying to replicate it under different conditions. The version of Iron Butterfly that had made In Agata da Vida was effectively finished by 1971, having never solved the problem of being a band whose one great idea couldn't be contained in the format the industry required. Number 6. Marble Breaks and Iron Bends by the Left Banke. The Left Banke were a New York band whose 1966 single Walk Away Renee was a genuine pop masterpiece, Baroque pop before anyone had a name for it, with string arrangements, harpsichord, and a melody that held up against anything being produced in London at the same time. Their follow-up, Pretty Ballerina, in early 1967, performed well enough to confirm they were not a one-single act. Then, the internal collapse began in earnest. Michael Brown, the band's keyboardist and primary songwriter, and the creative architect behind both hit singles, was a difficult personality to manage even in good times. He had feuded with the band's management almost from the beginning. By 1967, the relationship between Brown and the rest of the group had deteriorated to the point where both parties were making recordings under the Left Banke name simultaneously, with different lineups and different material. The legal and creative confusion was considerable. By 1968, the band had fractured badly enough that two separate groups were both using the Left Banke name for a period, which satisfied neither the label nor the listening public. Marble Breaks and Iron Bends, recorded in this period of fragmentation, failed commercially and found essentially no audience. The magic of the early singles had depended on a specific creative chemistry. Brown's orchestral instincts combined with the band's pop precision and the instability had made it impossible to reproduce. They dissolved shortly after, leaving behind two brilliant singles and the kind of cautionary story about internal tension that fills rock history. Brown went on to work with other artists, but never replicated what he had done in 1966. Number 5. Surprise Surprise by the Easybeats. The Easybeats were an Australian band formed in Sydney in 1964, largely by Dutch and English immigrants who had arrived in Australia through a government resettlement program. Their sound was sharp, energetic British invasion-influenced rock, and they scored one of the most explosive international hits of 1966 with Friday on My Mind, which reached number 6 in the UK and broke into the American top 30. It was a genuine achievement, an Australian band cracking markets that even established British acts struggled to penetrate. The song holds up today as one of the great pop records of the decade. What followed it was a series of singles that found essentially no traction in the markets the band had broken into. Funny Feeling, Land of Make-Believe, and Hello, How Are You all came and went without making the impression Friday on My Mind had. Surprise Surprise in 1968 was among several failed attempts to recapture that momentum on the international stage. The band had relocated from Australia to England in the hope of sustaining the breakthrough, which was the standard move for any act trying to work the British and American markets simultaneously, but they arrived without the local infrastructure that had supported them at home and found themselves in a London music scene crowded with established acts competing for the same radio slots and live venues. Their label, United Artists in the US, lost confidence and dropped them. The original lineup disbanded in 1969, worn down by the failure to find a second hit in the markets that had embraced the first. George Young and Harry Vanda, the band's primary songwriters, went on to become two of the most successful record producers in Australian music history, working with a long list of acts through the 1970s and 1980s. George Young is the older brother of Angus and Malcolm Young of AC/DC. The Easybeats ended, but the people inside it went on to shape what came after. Number 4. Try Too Hard by Dave Clark 5. The Dave Clark 5 were one of the most commercially successful British invasion acts of the early 1960s. Between 1964 and 1966, they had a remarkable run of hits in both the UK and the United States. Glad All Over, Bits and Pieces, Because, Catch Us If You Can. And at certain points, they were giving the Beatles genuine competition for radio airplay and chart positions. The DC-5 machine was efficient and prolific, releasing material at a pace that kept their name in front of audiences constantly. Then the momentum stalled in a way that the band couldn't reverse. Try Too Hard, released in 1966, peaked at number 12 in the US, not a commercial disaster by any ordinary measure, but significantly below what the band had been achieving in 1964 and 1965. More importantly, the singles that followed performed progressively worse. The pop landscape was changing rapidly around them. The move toward psychedelia, toward more complex studio production, toward album-oriented rock as a serious commercial and artistic proposition, all of it was happening while the DC-5 continued to operate as a singles-focused beat group in the mode they had established at the beginning of the decade. Dave Clark, who had always maintained unusually tight creative and business control over the band, he owned the master recordings, an arrangement that was extremely rare for the time, grew increasingly frustrated with the shifting landscape and the band's inability to adapt to it convincingly. The recordings they made in the late 1960s to keep pace with prevailing trends satisfied neither Clark nor their audience. By 1970, Clark had effectively disbanded the group. He described the decision in later interviews as deliberate. He didn't want to keep making music he didn't believe in, but the commercial slide that began around 1966 had been pointing toward that conclusion for some time. Number 3, Hurdy-Gurdy Man by Donovan and the session musicians who became Led Zeppelin. This entry requires some precision. Donovan's Hurdy-Gurdy Man reached number 5 in the US and 4 in the UK in 1968. It was not a commercial failure for Donovan himself. The band story attached to it is more complicated and more interesting. The session musicians assembled for the Hurdy-Gurdy Man recording included John Paul Jones on bass and arrangements, and Jimmy Page was involved in other sessions around the same period. John Bonham and Robert Plant were originally scheduled to participate in the Hurdy-Gurdy Man sessions, before plans changed, depending on which account you follow. This specific detail remains disputed. What is documented is that Jones and Page took what they learned from the commercial session world of that period and applied it directly to forming Led Zeppelin in 1968, with Plant and Bonham completing the lineup.
When the hurdy-gurdy man came singing song.
The broader point is that the commercial session infrastructure of late 1960s British pop, the world that produced records like Hurdy-Gurdy Man, was simultaneously incubating the musicians who would dismantle that entire model and replace it with something heavier and more album-focused. Several acts who depended on that pop session world found themselves without an audience as the decade turned. Number 2. We Can Work It Out by the Beatles and its effect on the songwriting partnership.
We can work it out. We can work it out.
We Can Work It Out was a 1965 double A-side with Day Tripper, and it went to number 1 on both sides of the Atlantic. It was not a commercial failure in any sense. It was one of the biggest records the Beatles released that year. But the song's creation is one of the clearest early signals of the tension that would eventually break the band apart. And it belongs in any honest discussion of the records whose making accelerated the dissolution of the most successful group in pop history. Paul McCartney wrote the verse and the chorus, the optimistic, forward-moving sections that drive the song. John Lennon wrote the bridge, the section in the middle that shifts into waltz time and introduces a different perspective entirely. Where McCartney's sections push toward resolution, Lennon's bridge asks whether life is really so short as to make patience impossible. The contrast was not accidental. Lennon later spoke about how that particular structural division captured something real about how he and McCartney were different people with different ways of seeing the same problems.
Think of what you're saying. You can get it wrong.
McCartney wanted resolution. He believed in working things out, in finding common ground, in making the effort. Lennon was less convinced that common ground was reliably available and less interested in pretending otherwise. Those different temperaments had produced extraordinary music together for years because the tension between them was generative. By the mid-1960s, it was starting to become something harder to manage. That dynamic played out across the remaining 5 years of the band's existence with increasing intensity. As their personal lives diverged and their artistic interests pulled in different directions, the gap that We Can Work It Out captures in miniature grew wider and wider. The song is a beautiful, compact early version of the argument that eventually ended the Beatles.
We can work it out. We can work it out.
Number 1. Revolution 9 by the Beatles. Revolution 9 appeared on the White Album in November 1968, and it is the most genuinely divisive thing the Beatles ever released. It is not a song in any conventional sense. It is an 8-minute sound collage assembled primarily by John Lennon and Yoko Ono, using tape loops, reversed audio, fragments of speech and chanting, BBC sound effects recordings, and elements pulled from an orchestral overdub session originally intended for a different track. Ringo Starr and Paul McCartney were opposed to including it on the album. George Harrison was neutral. Lennon insisted. And on this particular question, his will prevailed. The argument over Revolution 9 was not simply a creative disagreement about a single unconventional track. It was a proxy conflict for everything that was pulling the band apart through late 1968. Lennon's increasing immersion in avant-garde experimentation that his bandmates could not share or fully understand. Ono's expanding presence in the studio in a way that violated the unspoken rules the band had always operated by. McCartney's insistence on maintaining a certain standard of musical craft and commercial purpose, and the general collapse of the collaborative atmosphere that had sustained them through the Sgt. Pepper's sessions just a year earlier.
Number 9.
George Martin, their producer since 1962, was deeply uncomfortable with the track and said so. Jeff Emmerich, their recording engineer through some of the band's most important sessions, left the White Album recording partway through the process because the atmosphere in the studio had become so unpleasant that he could no longer work there. Those were not trivial departures. These were people who had been essential to the Beatles' sound and who chose to walk away rather than continue watching what was happening. Revolution 9 did not destroy the Beatles on its own. There is no single song or moment that accounts for the end of something that complicated, but it was one of the most visible points where it became apparent to everyone present that the band was no longer the same thing it had been. They released Let It Be and Abbey Road after the White Album. Neither session was peaceful. The end was already visible in the room when they were making it. The music that lasted from the 1960s was built on creative ambition, and sometimes that ambition pushed things past the breaking point. These are the songs and the moments where the cracks first became impossible to ignore. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There is a lot more where this came from.